Hi. Again, I'm Yvette Siddon. I work at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center over in Juneau, and I'm really excited to be here. Like Deanna, it's a little nerve-wracking to be up here on this stage, but I was thinking, how could we ease this nervousness? And I'll say, the bar has been set high for you as an audience. In all of the preparation for WhaleFest, being told the audience is engaged, they're, informed, they're really knowledgeable. So I have high expectations of you as well. Okay. I'm not even going to get this part wrong. There we go. There's the outline. I'm going to talk first just a little bit of background about me, how I got to Alaska and how I got to doing research in the Bering Sea. And then I'm going to talk about sea ice as pretty clear evidence of climate change in our region, in Alaska. Then I'm going to give two examples, one about shifting boundaries and one about new horizons, both sort of fisheries horizons and science horizons. Okay, here we go. I am from the East Coast. Originally, I grew up in New Hampshire. I went to the University of New Hampshire for my undergraduate degree, and I largely went there so that I could go to the Shoals Marine Lab. Show of hands, has anybody heard about the Shoals Marine Lab? Nice. All right. Off the coast of Maine. Took a class there about called underwater research as an undergraduate, and basically spent the next probably 10 to 15 years of my life going anywhere and everywhere I could to scuba dive, including to Juneau, where I came to the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences to study Nereocystis, or bull kelp, as nearshore habitats for fish around Juneau. And really fell in love with Juneau, fell in love with Alaska, and stayed after my master's and continued at the university on to a PhD, but moved my research to the Bering Sea, and I left this little trajectory map. I assure you, I love my family, 3,500 miles away, back on the East Coast, but really also now really fell in love with the Bering Sea, and I have studied the Bering Sea since my graduate work. This is a picture of me, I think actually on the Oscar Dyson, which Deanna introduced you to, studying some jellyfish. Nowadays, my work looks a little bit more like this at a computer. So again, really grateful to be here and away from my computer for the weekend. But what I get to do at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, I always tell people, I have the best job at the center. I produce what we call our ecosystem status report for the Eastern Bering Sea, and I get to work with, picture Deanna times 115 other Deannas, people who are experts in their field and so knowledgeable and so excited and interested in their particular piece, and I get to look at all of it and think about how all of those pieces are connected and paint a picture for our fisheries managers about what is happening in our ecosystem every year. I have two main coworker counterparts. We do the same thing for the Aleutian Islands and the same thing for the Gulf of Alaska, because those are three very different marine ecosystems in Alaska. So I really focus on the Eastern Bering Sea. Okay, so here are our large marine ecosystems in Alaska. We're here in Sitka in the Eastern Gulf of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, which I just mentioned, the Eastern Bering Sea, which goes all the way from the Aleutians up to the Bering Strait, and then north of the Bering Strait, the Chukchi and Beaufort up in the Arctic as another large marine ecosystem. We don't produce an ecosystem status report for the Arctic because we produce these status reports for use in federal fisheries management decisions, and there are not currently federal fisheries in the Arctic. So we produce these reports for the Bering Sea, Aleutians, and Gulf of Alaska. Okay, I'm really going to focus on the Bering Sea, so I want to orient you, if you're not familiar, trying to think about how can I describe this place to people. So Sitka, we're at about 57 degrees north, and the Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea. St. Paul Island is also at 57 degrees north. So just to give you some context about, I'm going to talk a lot about St. Paul as a reference point for where sea ice goes or doesn't go in any given year. Same latitude as Sitka, about 2,100 kilometers west of Sitka, but same latitude. The Bering Sea shelf, just for scale, is about 1,200 kilometers long, about 500 kilometers wide. If that's hard math in your head, I like to think of it as one California. I'm also from the East Coast. It's 366 Rhode Island. I assure you that I did not put 366 on there, so those are not to scale. But then I was like, well, how many Sitkas is it? Sitka, because you've got most of Baranof in your city and borough, you're bigger than Rhode Island. So it's about 100 Sitkas in the Bering Sea shelf. All right, the average depth in the Bering Sea is pretty shallow. It's only about 70 meters deep. Who's our #1 fish in the Bering Sea? Pollock. Has anyone eaten pollock? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. In what? What is it? Filet of fish? My childhood dinner? Crab with a K? All pollock. It is the #1 fishery in the US by volume. Anyone know the #1 fishery by value? It's not in Alaska. It's tiny. Scallops. Scallops out of New Bedford. So this #1 fishery in Alaska, #1 fishery in the world, landed to Unalaska. That's where it's sort of counted. So Unalaska is the #1 port in the US for fisheries. The pollock industry as a whole every year has about a $2 billion value. It supports about 30,000 jobs. And you have probably heard about pollock, the pollock industry and the trawl industry a lot in the headlines in the last year or so as it relates to bycatch. And this is just to say I am not going to focus on bycatch today, but there is a lot of work going on and a lot of intersections looking at how, as Deanna talked about, shifting distributions, and I'll talk about how climate change is having an impact on rates of bycatch and other things. So who else lives in the Bering Sea? Pacific cod, yellowfin sole, arrowtooth flounder, several different salmon species, but also different seasonal and runs of different salmon stocks. And then crab, so king crab, tanner crab, and snow crab you've maybe also heard about in the headlines in the Bering Sea. The North Pacific Fisheries Management Council is the body who oversees federal fisheries. So they are the ones who set the quotas every year, and they set them for over 140 target species. And in Alaska, this process happens on an annual basis for all of our stocks. We do crab in October, we do groundfish in December, and so the work that we do on all of the ecosystem information comes together real quickly. As soon as Deanna gets off that boat from her survey, we're pulling everything together so that we can put it in front of our managers when they set the quotas every year. That idea of pairing the ecosystem information in both time, like at every point where managers are considering making decisions, we present the ecosystem information. And it's as simple as we present first. We give them the context of what's happening before they then go to think about whether or not they should make adjustments in their quotas. It seems really simple when I say it, and you're probably thinking, that makes sense, Yvette. Not every region does that. So we're really lucky in Alaska. Our system has embraced that even though it might be qualitative, it is still that contextual information is what they want to hear before they make their decisions. And we refer to it, am I doing that? Okay. Dun, dun, dun. It's called ecosystem-based fisheries management. Okay, very dramatic. Okay, and I put this slide in here to remind myself to say, because I often forget, the Bering Sea is also a giant mudflat. So if you're from Sitka and you're thinking about really rocky, rugged, diverse terrain, it's not like that in the Bering Sea. It is a big, broad, shallow, muddy shelf. But it's also, why is it then so productive, has a lot to do with the currents and the water flow. So this is a map of all of Alaska. The arrows are different currents. So they generally go from Eastern Gulf, east to west, and then the water flows through the Aleutian passes, in some cases, up onto the Bering Sea shelf, and then also flows from the deep basin off of the Bering Sea shelf on. So it's all this sort of upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water onto the shelf that sustains all of that productivity of all of that pollock and other species living there. Okay. Here comes one of my 2 data slides. This is going to be data from the Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea, and again, to sort of set the stage of what we're talking about for climate change in the region. This is a time series of air temperatures measured at St. Paul Island, and if you look at the horizontal axis, back over 100 years that they have had this data collection in the Bering Sea. On the vertical axis is a temperature anomaly. So that just means if it's red and above the line, it was above average temperatures. And if it's blue, they were below average temperatures. And you can see over the last 100 years, the Bering Sea has had both above average and below average temperatures. But since 2014, the Bering Sea entered the longest and warmest warm phase on record that we know of anyway. So it is the warmest both like in magnitude and duration that we've experienced. So much of what I'll talk about today is what happened during that warm phase and what have we seen since it's sort of cooled back to average. Not to cool, just to average in the Bering Sea. Okay, so let's talk about sea ice. Here's a map of the Bering Sea just to orient you. That dot is St. Paul Island, or the Pribilofs, and the white is sea ice. So in the Bering Sea, the sea ice comes down every winter and then retreats back. So it's seasonal sea ice, and it comes down different degrees, different extents every year based on both temperature and winds are the 2 main drivers of how much and where sea ice goes. So this is just to demonstrate a couple of different years, right? So 2014, the sea ice did not come down very far. It didn't touch the Pribilofs. In fact, it didn't even come over the southern half of the Bering Sea shelf. 2015, right? You get the idea. Different extents every year until 2018. No sea ice over the shelf at all. And that was something that modelers had predicted would happen, but not that would have happened as early as it did in 2018. So that was surprising, and we have, thankfully, in Alaska, great surveys, lots of people out on the water surveying every year to keep that finger on the pulse about, what are we going to see that's different? So when you think about this seasonal sea ice and this variability, why does it matter? In a couple different ways. It creates a very different ecosystem, whether you're in the Bering Sea in winter and there's ice cover, or in the summer and it's open water. That ice cover provides a habitat for animals, but also is really important in terms of transportation or fishing in different regions as a platform. So on the left is what they call pancake ice, when ice starts to form in the fall. And then on the right is a picture of the airport at Little Diomede on the sea ice. But it also acts as a blanket, right? So it is reflecting the sea light, which is also reflecting warmth and keeping the system cooler. So without the sea ice, the ocean is absorbing that temperature or that heat instead. But it also acts as a buffer to the system, so you don't have as much impact of storms if you have the sea ice there as a cover to the ocean. All right, so why does sea ice matter to the ecosystem? We've talked about what it does to the surface. What does it do to the ecosystem? And this is a graphic to just explain how we get from the top of the ocean to the bottom for the role of sea ice. First, when that salt water freezes, the salts are extruded. So they're not included in the part that freezes. That means that the water around where the ice is forming becomes saltier, which is denser. So now you have cold, dense water that sinks to the bottom of the ocean where the ice is. That cold, dense water forms what we call the cold pool. And the cold pool is a footprint of where sea ice was the winter before. So you have winter sea ice, summer cold pool over the shelf. That cold pool, things either like to be in it or they don't. So it changes the distribution of things over the Bering Sea shelf year to year, right? That picture of all those different maps, it's changing every year. So here's an example. This is a map of the cold pool in 2010. 2010 was an extensive sea ice year. The ice came down over much of the shelf. And then this is a output of the bottom temperatures the following summer. The black outline there is not just a squished version of California. That is the outline of our annual bottom trawl survey. So that's the region of the southern Bering Sea that we sample every year in the Bering Sea. So whether or not that cold pool is over the shelf, we pick up in the bottom trawl survey, and we can look at the distributions of things. This is now a map also from 2010 of where pollock were over the shelf in the Bering Sea. So the underlying colored part, the green and the darky blue color, that's an interpolation of where pollock were. So the part towards the land that's green, those are low densities of pollock. Out on the outer shelf where that dark blue color is, really high densities of pollock. And the cloud color overlaid there is just to denote where that cold pool was. The coldest bottom waters were right over the middle of the shelf. The adult pollock don't like to be in it. So and they don't like to be in the inner domain. It's like Goldilocks. It's too warm, it's too cold. They're in the outer domain outside of the cold pool. That matters for pollock especially. They're a very cannibalistic species. So they eat their young. Their young like to be in the cold pool. So if there's a cold pool, we tend to think that provides some spatial separation from the cannibalistic adults. And all kinds of species there are shown. Some prefer to be in it, some don't prefer to be in it. And so again, it matters to the whole ecosystem where sea ice goes and where that footprint of cold pool is every year over the shelf. Okay, so now we're just gonna walk through time to look at I showed you some variability in sea ice. We have maps, this is going back 20 years, starting in 2005 in the top left, of where the cold pool is over the shelf. So again, that black outline is our bottom trawl survey, so you can use it as a reference. How much of our survey area was in the cold or included the cold pool or not varies from year to year. And we have some years where, much of our survey area, the cold pool is pretty extensive through especially 2012, 2013. We enter that warm period in the Bering Sea in 2014. We start to see that cold pool shrink as the system is warming now year over year. That idea that it's cumulative, so it's warm and then warm begets warm because you don't have that blanket of sea ice over the system. Until we get to 2017, there's 2018. There is no cold pool within our standard bottom trawl survey area. And then again in 2019, no cold pool 2 years in a row over the shelf in the Bering Sea. And then we've returned to average, not to cool, since then through, this is last summer, 2024 in the bottom right, that thin tongue of cold bottom water over the shelf. In 2018, I just did a quick search the other day for headlines, right? It was big news that there was no cold pool over the shelf. We picked it up in our survey, and then headlines started coming out. Most unprecedented transition in history. Shock and thaw, unprecedented. Again, Unprecedented, Bering Sea loses half its sea ice in 2 weeks. These were all in 2018, but then it happened again in 2019. Unprecedented again the second year. So what did the fish do as a response to both the extended warm phase and these two unprecedented events in the middle of it of really warm, no sea ice, no cold pool over the shelf? How did it affect fish distributions? Like Deanna said with the copepods, the fish shifted north. That's a common strategy to try to find the little niche window of water that you want to be in, that you prefer to be in. So this is now an example. On the left, 2010, and on the right, that first year of no sea ice, 2018. These are maps of the cold pool and that standard bottom trawl grid. Now I'm going to show the same 2 years with the distributions of Pacific cod. Same idea as before. The background color is the distribution of Pacific cod, including the sort of darker blue colors around the end. And in the middle, now the cloud is hot pink. That's showing where the cold pool was in that year. Pacific cod adults like pollock don't like to be in the cold pool. So they're sort of all the way around the edges and along the outer shelf. That cold pool is like a barrier to these fish, right? So when we remove that barrier in 2018, the fish can move north. And there they go, 50% of the biomass. The stock assessment from 2017 to 2018, 50% of the biomass of Pacific cod moved into the northern Bering Sea. So there they are, north between St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait. As the ecosystem status report author, I'm there to provide context about what's happening. And we're getting, 115 contributors of expertise to help us understand what happened. So we start looking at different clues in the system. And one of the first ones in 2019 was the short-tailed shearwater die-off event. Also in 2019 was the start of the gray whale unusual mortality event that continued until 2023. And in 2021, the collapse of the Bering Sea snow crab. Now, I said every year in our system, we present first to the council before they make any decisions, and they would say to us, why are you telling us about gray whales? Why are you telling us about short-tailed shearwaters? Well, this is my brain in the fall. On the left is 115 experts telling me all these pieces of evidence, pieces of information. And it's my job to figure out, is there a common thread to all of these pieces that we do have our finger on the pulse of, but what do they mean holistically? And in this case, the story was, these are all things that feed in the northern Bering Sea. Short-tailed shearwaters feed in the northern Bering Sea before they embark on really long migrations down to the southern hemisphere. Gray whales feed in the northern Bering Sea before they embark on long migrations to southern California. These are things that need to find enough food in the northern Bering Sea, and they're dying on their way back to or from these long migrations because our hypothesis was they can't find enough food. As the Pacific cod shifted north, they were another mouth in the system, scooping up those inches of amphipods on the bottom of the seafloor and taking, really too much pressure that northern Bering Sea ecosystem couldn't sustain. And snow crab, which you've probably also seen in the headlines, are another example. When Pacific cod shifted north, their diets were chock full of juvenile snow crab, which was part of the contributing factor to the snow crab collapse, in addition to they couldn't find enough food. Okay, not all things do poorly under climate change. So these are some examples. I'm sure you've seen the headlines, right? The snow crab collapse and the impact that has on the economics and the fisheries are big headlines, but they're also big impacts to the ecosystem. So snow crab are an example of something that did not do well under this change in the ecosystem. Many of the Western Alaska salmon stocks, I'm not going to talk on them a lot today, but we know those stocks have also collapsed in these warm periods. Another example of things that are not doing well under warm conditions. However, on the flip side, sablefish or black cod, they have had really high recruitment years starting in 2014 every year all the way through 2019 in these warm conditions. And as their population has done so well and expanded, which is generally thought of as a Gulf of Alaska stock, the juveniles, they've now they need to find more room, there's so many of them. The juveniles have spread into the southern Bering Sea. Togiak herring, also in this extended warm period, have had 2 years of high recruitment in Togiak as well. And then lastly, Bristol Bay sockeye. So many runs of salmon have collapsed, yet Bristol Bay sockeye has done well for a variety of different reasons unique to their lake ecosystems as well. But from 2015 through 2023, above average run sizes into Bristol Bay. But it isn't just sort of gram of biomass for gram of biomass, right? It matters what the balance and the makeup of that ecosystem is. So sometimes people try to publish big generic studies about just biomass, and that loses the importance of it matters what's making up that ecosystem. So that is where we're going to go next for the last section on New Horizons. We're going to talk about pollock again. And I want to remind us here, so this is, again, that air temperature time series from St. Paul Island. And prior to 2000, it sort of oscillated year to year. There was a warm year and a cold year and a warm year and a cold year. And so there isn't that cumulative impact of it being warm. After 2000, we started to have these sort of multi-year stanzas, a couple years of warm, a couple years of cold. Now we're in this era of prolonged and warmer situation in the Bering Sea. So I'm going to align that with what the pollock stock is doing. So this is going to be a figure out of the stock assessment model for pollock, and I've shifted it over where it is on purpose. I'm going to try to align the years so you can see impact of temperature on the impact of the stock. So in that, after 2000, couple years of warm in the Bering Sea, the pollock population dropped 40%. And you can sort of ignore why there's pink and blue. It's a stock assessment model thing. There's 2 different estimates. But overall, dropped 40%. This is, again, the #1 fishery in the US. And then the following cold period, they rebounded. And that sort of whole story prompted the North Pacific Research Board to fund the Bering Sea Integrated Ecosystem Research Project to understand the Bering Sea ecosystem, but also understand, can we figure out what drives pollock? A lot of people want to know, a lot of dollars want to know what drives pollock in the Bering Sea. And I'll summarize hundreds of people's research over many years. One of the main outcomes of that work was we noticed differences in the zooplankton community composition between warm years and cold years. And in warm years, the species that were out there were smaller. I mean, there's just totally different species. Smaller, fewer of them, and the ones that were out there are lesser quality. Versus cold years, they're bigger, they're just big, fat species. There's more of them, and they're more nutritious. So that led to one of the probably most impactful outcomes of the Bering Sea project, which was to explain the driver, explain why pollock do better in cold years than they do in warm years. And it has to do with the fish, on the left there in a cold year, they get fat food, so they themselves are fatter, and they overwinter, they survive that first winter of their life better and go on to live in the population. Whereas in warm years, their food is skinnier, it's less nutrition, they themselves are skinnier and less nutritious, and there's higher rates of cannibalism, and then fewer of them survive winter. So that was the outcome of all of that work, is really to explain how we understand how the Bering Sea ecosystem and pollock respond to warm and cold years. So here's the quiz. Now we're in the longest, warmest period of the Bering Sea. What happened to the pollock? Sorry. I said down 2 originally. No, they're doing really well. In fact, 2018 was a banner recruitment year class of pollock. The year smack in the middle of a warm phase, smack in the middle of no sea ice in the Bering Sea. How did that happen? And I think this is really where we are in our understanding. Like, I want to be honest, I'm not going to pretend that I have this answer. This is really the thinking that we're all currently going through right now. How did they manage to do that? We have some hypotheses, of course. One is maybe they found other food. We call it functional redundancy. But maybe it isn't all about large copepods. Maybe they found krill to eat. Maybe they actually didn't eat as many of their own young. In fact, 2018 was the lowest rate of cannibalism in the time series. I don't know why. That's what they tell me, though. And maybe it's that the balance of the ecosystem has shifted. The rules of the game have changed. Who's in the Bering Sea right now? A ton of pollock. Who's not in the Bering Sea? Salmon, right? The dynamics of everything out there have changed. So I started to title this slide Lessons Learned. But I want to be honest, right? Like, lessons we're still learning, and that's the exciting part about doing the work that we do. We'll never be done. But here's sort of how I think about it. So our fisheries are clearly already challenged by extreme climate events. These black swan events like 2018 and 2019 are going to be really difficult to predict. And I don't think that we can expect to be able to tell the council what will happen if we see one of these black swan events. But I think we can tell the council we should expect a response comparable to the impact of whatever it is, right? We have a big event, unprecedented and then unprecedented again. We should expect that the system will respond somehow. We might not know exactly how. So the response will vary, and the species impacted will also change over time. When the blob hit the Gulf of Alaska and Pacific cod crashed here in 2014 to 16, and then a second heat wave came in 2018, we don't expect cod to crash again. They already crashed. But something else will happen the second time. Some of the impacts of climate change, right? We can have shifting distributions, which means we have shifting overlap of fish and food and what prey are available to different fish. We see, because we work, right, both Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Gulf of Alaska, we see similar themes across the different regions, things like starvation or not being able to find enough food, carrying capacity. Those themes are very similar across the regions, but the particular species involved might change. And these responses, we have to be ready for them to either be immediate, maybe we see some impacts in the same year, some of them will be lagged. Maybe we don't see them for a year or two after. And then the sort of hardest one to tease apart are these cumulative ones, where it matters how many years in a row those conditions persist. And then takeaways, I know I didn't talk about it a lot today, but I do think it is probably the biggest challenge, maybe even comparable to the challenge of how we deal with climate change, but how we are going to use traditional knowledge in our system. We are asked for it at the council with, nobody really has guidance of the how to do that. And we've tried in various ways to offer instances of traditional knowledge, but still, from the people asking for it, not a lot of really sense of what to do with it. And I have tried to make the case, everything I do about, taking pieces of knowledge from all of the contributors and thinking about how all the pieces of the system relate. We call that ecosystem-based fisheries management. I try to make the case traditional knowledge, they are practitioners of ecosystem-based fisheries management for longer time series than we will ever have, Western science data for. So we've got to figure out how we can use that in our system. We need to keep our finger on the pulse if we want to be able to detect change and then see the response to it. And then lastly, don't get too confident that you understand the system. Keep asking yourself if the system has changed under your feet as you've been looking, because it does, and we have to be willing to, not that we were wrong, but now we're learning new stuff and it's different. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
What international fisheries are active in the Bering Sea, and what about the part of the Bering Sea that's west of American territory?
Yeah, the question was about international fisheries and west of where our survey line ends. Pollock, Russian pollock fisheries are the biggest one. Kamchatka, Asian hatchery salmon is a big one. These are things we know impact the Bering Sea, but we don't have good data on. We know that pollock in the Bering Sea don't know there's that date line, they don't know where that line is, and they're crossing it without we didn't tell them they could go there. That's happening all the time. And so as things shift north, the Bering Sea narrows into the Bering Strait. So things are either going to run out of space, they're going to cross into the Arctic and maybe figure out how to live there, but also going west into Russian waters. Yeah, it's a tricky relationship.
Hi, I have a question. Just
Let's see. Where's that coming from?
a big picture question. These fish, sablefish and pollock, evolutionarily, how old are they in their current modern form? And then how many cycles of warming and cooling have they survived?
Great question. So the question was evolutionarily the age of things like pollock or sablefish, and have they experienced cycles like we're seeing now? I mean, it's a great question, and I don't have a good answer other than, I guess the way I think about it is things like pollock and sablefish I think of as weedy species. They're weedy, like weeds in your garden. They somehow figure out how to adapt and sort of make do and continue to do well in a system when others, like Pacific cod, don't seem to be adapting or as resilient to what has happened most recently in the Bering Sea. Their population is not rebounding and having high numbers like pollock and sablefish are.
So my question kind of gets to how genetically plastic are these fish, and are they coping with things they have coped with before evolutionarily?
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask is when you say recruits the fish recruit, So like if they're like year class type fishery, how many years previous, at what age do you say recruit, and at what age were they spawned and subject to those climate conditions? And that's my last question.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't have a good answer for your first one about genetics and evolutionary response to these different species, to these different climate regimes. I just am not a geneticist and or evolutionary biologist, except I suspect my sense is they're fairly plastic because they seem to be dealing with, at least in the recent data time series, finding ways to still do well. The second question was, remind me about, oh, when do they spawn? Yes. So yes, recruiting and year classes of different stocks, it depends. So pollock, the 2018 year class, so age 0 in 2018, is right now 6 years later the main age of fish that industry is catching. So they're about, plus or minus a year, 6 years old when they are the main target of the fishery, but that age differs for different species. Stablefish are really fast growing, so I think they are recruited to the fishery at a younger age.
I have two questions.
Coming from, I can't see anyone. Oh, hi.
One is, are you seeing that the crab are moving in the same way that the fish populations were moving north? And then, is it possible, or is anyone looking at if the crab have disappeared from this area, were they eating the young pollock, and then that's why they're proliferating in the area, because the crab aren't eating the younger fish?
Okay, great questions. One was about whether crab have shifted north. And yes, snow crab especially are basically always going to be linked to where the sea ice is. So as sea ice goes, snow crab will go. Whether the lack of snow crab explains the high year of pollock, I don't think so. I don't think they would overlap enough sort of in the water column, right? Snow crab are down on the bottom, and pollock, juvenile pollock, and larval especially are higher up in the water column. I don't think those two things are related. I suspect it's some other similar thing happening in the ecosystem, but impacting them both differently. One more question? Okay.
I have a question here. So I know you're not excited to talk about bycatch, but do you have a sense of how bycatch has changed over the years, like composition, abundance, and that sort of thing?
I am not an expert in bycatch. I deal with it mainly as indicators of what's happening in the ecosystem. So, and the fleets are managed, right? So if there's an issue with bycatch, like Chinook salmon, the trawl industry will have limits imposed that will cap how many they can catch. Same with herring, they can't catch, more than so many herring to protect the herring. So a lot of now in the news and what the council is dealing with now is a chum salmon. Should they impose a chum salmon bycatch? There's not one right now, so that's what they're dealing with. And in the ecosystem report, really what I try to do is look at what's happening in the ecosystem and what's happening with trends in bycatch just help us paint a bigger picture. So are fish shifting their distribution and then ending up overlapping with where the trawl industry is? Those kinds of efforts are underway, modeling with temperatures and fishing distribution, but I don't, I try to stay in my ecosystem lane of, what is it telling us about the ecosystem?
All right, well, thank you for those questions, and a huge thank you to Yvette for her amazing talk.